Hello, everybody. Welcome to Common Sense Conversations, or as we call it, Conversations with Common Sense. We're delighted to have you here today for another in our series of discussions about some of the topics that we're all trying to deal with during this extraordinary COVID-19 epidemic. And today we have an unbelievably interesting guest who I'll be introducing in a second. Just at the outset, I want to thank everybody for joining us here at Conversation with Common Sense, and also tell you that if you haven't already done so, please check out the website that Common Sense Media just launched a few weeks ago, wideopenschool.org, which is a major new distance learning portal for families and for schools all across the United States to help you and your kids deal with the extraordinary challenges of the COVID-19 epidemic. We at Common Sense are proud to have that platform as part of our broad offerings to kids and families and schools around the United States. So please join us at wideopenschool.org this week and make sure your kids are doing as well as they can under the circumstances. As the father of four, I can tell you it is certainly a challenge. And as the founder of Common Sense Media, Jim Steyer, that's me, I couldn't be more delighted than to have our guest here today, because joining us for Conversations with Common Sense is the 19th Surgeon General of the United States, my friend Vivek Murthy, who is one of the most important experts in the United States on not just public health issues, but also on issues related to mental health and kids and teens' ability and families' ability to withstand the challenges of this extraordinary set of circumstances we're all living in. And Vivek has a new book out right now that is an absolutely fantastic book called Together: The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Because if we ever needed human connections, it's now. And if you literally want to know the best expert in the United States, if not the world, on human connections and how it relates to all of us and our health, it's my friend Vivek, Dr. Vivek Murthy. So welcome, Vivek. And thank you so much for joining us. Let me start out by asking you a very basic question. What led you to write this book? You're a doctor, you're a public health expert. Why did you write this masterpiece of a book on connections and loneliness? What led you to this book?
Well, thanks, Jim. First, let me just say how happy I am to be here. I'm so glad we're doing this together, and grateful for all of your leadership and the great work that Common Sense has done over the years for all of society. So thank you for all of that as well. You know, if you had told me, Jim, 5 years ago that we would be here talking about this subject, I would have been skeptical, because it was not in my plan to talk about or think about social connection and loneliness. But what happened to me, Jim, is that during the beginning of my time as Surgeon General, I spent a number of months just traveling the country talking to people about what was on their mind, what was concerning to them. And I heard stories about substance use disorders, about depression, about anxiety. I heard about violence in communities. I heard from parents who were concerned that their kids were using technology more than they were comfortable with and were wondering, is it hurting or is it helping them? But behind so many of these conversations, behind so many of these stories, were these threads of loneliness that I started to pick up on. And it was subtle at first, but people would never come up to me and say, "Hi, I'm Jim, I'm Vivek, I'm lonely." But they would say things like, "I feel I have to carry all of these burdens by myself." Or "I feel if I disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice," or "I feel invisible." And hearing that again and again made me realize that there was something deeper happening here that I had not fully appreciated before. Although it did remind me of my own struggles as a child, dealing with loneliness in elementary school and being scared to come to school because I was worried about being alone on the playground or in the cafeteria. And it also reminded me of my interactions with patients in the hospital, where even though I trained to take care of a number of illnesses in medical school and residency, I never really learned how to think about loneliness or how to support a patient when they showed up and when it became clear that they were lonely. I was reminded of those experiences as Surgeon General, having these conversations in living rooms and town halls. And it made me realize that what I was seeing was not unique to my own experience, that there was something much deeper happening in terms of loneliness around the country, and it turns out around the world as well.
And how do we all know we all probably have our own definitions of what it means to feel lonely. And I'm sure we have all at different times in our lives felt lonely. That's interesting. You talked about when you were a little kid going to school and feeling lonely. I remember that as well. How do you define loneliness though? Is there sort of a definition for loneliness that we could use, or what do you think?
So I think there is, and it's actually, I'm glad you brought it up because there are distinctions between loneliness and isolation and between solitude as well. And it's helpful to understand these. Loneliness is a subjective feeling, and it's a feeling that the connections that we need in our life are greater than the connections we have. And in that gap, we experience loneliness. But it's distinct from isolation, which is an objective descriptor of how many people we have around us. So you could have, for example, 20, 30, 40, 50 people around you, hundreds of people around you, and still feel profoundly lonely if you don't feel that you can show up as yourself, if you don't feel that you can be open with the people around you and that you won't be judged. So it's really about the quality of the connections that we enjoy. And I should say that on this front, while I began writing this book about loneliness, what I became utterly fascinated by is the extraordinary power of human connection to help us not only live healthier lives, but also to improve our performance in school and in the workplace, to enhance our ability to dialogue with neighbors and in our community more broadly, to increase our fulfillment in life. And one of the reasons ultimately that I have decided to focus on this topic is not just because I want us to address loneliness, but because I think we have left this extraordinary resource of human connection on the table. And as we've developed new medicines and developed medical technology and other extraordinary innovations, I think we have sometimes forgotten how powerful some of the tools that were already in our quiver actually are. And human connection is one of those resources that we've had for thousands of years. And this is actually our moment, our opportunity to recenter ourselves on human connection, to recapture the power that it can play in our lives.
Yeah. And by the way, you're right, Vivek. This is a moment because we're all experiencing some elements of this in the COVID-19 epidemic. And because we've had to shelter at home and deal with that, I mean, what a perfect time for your book to come out. Let me ask you a question. Do you think of loneliness as a stigma for people? And do you think that there are physical manifestations of loneliness as well as sort of anxiety, depression, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There is an unfortunate stigma around loneliness. And I say that not just theoretically, but because as a child, I experienced that myself. You know, I never told my parents or anyone really throughout all those years that I struggled with loneliness as a child, never really told them what was going on because I was ashamed. I was ashamed that if I said I was lonely, that meant that I was broken or unlikable in some way. And I didn't want to feel that. And I think that same sense of shame affects a lot of people, and it prevents people from talking about what they're going through, but sometimes even admitting to themselves that they're lonely. The other thing that's interesting about loneliness is that it doesn't always look like this stereotype of a person sitting alone in the corner of a room during a party, but it can present as irritability and anger. It can present as withdrawal from others, which is counterintuitive. It can present as depression, as anxiety, or sleep disturbances. It can look like different things in our life. One thing I found that's very interesting is that when you look at older men who go through one of three major life experiences, they either retire or they get sick or they lose a spouse, that often is a cliff in terms of when they begin to really experience loneliness. But it often shows up in their life as irritability and as anger. And that's how their families will often describe it. But if you don't know that loneliness is the great masquerader in this way, that it looks like different things in different people, then you can miss that. And you can just think, well, you know, my family member is just being angry, or they're irritable, or they're upset about something else. Whereas really it may be a lack of social connection that's at the deeper root cause of what's ailing them.
That's so interesting because in my own experience, I remember being very lonely in high school. And I'm a people person, you know, I'm out there, you know me. I mean, but I was very lonely for a period in high school. And, you know, I remember too, I lived in the biggest city in the United States, New York City. So how could you be lonely in the biggest city in the world with so many, you know, 8 million people around you? But you're exactly right. And it does play out differently for people. I have a question because in addition to the fact that this is a moment, this is truly a moment for all of us to deal with loneliness and the need for human connection. It's also a moment where, you know, at Common Sense for the 16 years of the organization's history, we've always talked about screen time and limiting screen time and balance. I mean, that's sort of the Common Sense message is finding a balanced approach to media and screen time and technology, et cetera. But now, how much do you think that technology is a player in the issue of loneliness and the existence of or lack of good human connections?
Well, that's such a good question. And Jim, I'll tell you that the most common question I got around the country when I would talk about this, both during my time as Surgeon General and afterward, was the question, is this because of technology? And I think it's on the minds of parents, of all of us, because we know our lives have been fundamentally changed, our interactions have been changed by tech. And the question is for the better or for the worse. I think that at the end of the day, I think technology is a tool. The question is, how are we using it? And are we using it in ways that strengthen our connection or weaken our connection? There are some ways where I think it can benefit us. So for example, during this time of COVID-19, if we're not able to see other people, but we use, let's say, our iPad to video conference with a friend, so we can catch up with them and see how they are. If we use it to speak to a loved one who might be in the hospital and unable to receive visitors, then it could be an incredibly valuable lifeline to them. If we actually are traveling to another city, during non-pandemic time, and we use our iPad to, or it's not our iPad rather, but we use Facebook or another social media platform to post, so our friends can see that we're coming through New York or through San Francisco, and then we meet up with people in person. All of those are ways in which tech can really help us. But here's a challenge. If we use technology in ways that allow our time in front of screens to crowd out our quality time in person with others, that can be problematic. If we allow technology to invade this space of our interactions and our conversations, such that we're catching up with friends, but we're also checking our email, we're also refreshing our social media feed, we're Googling questions that pop into our head, looking at the news in between, that can dilute the quality of the conversation, no matter how good we think we are at multitasking. And there's a last element to tech that I worry about in particular for our kids. And this has to do with how technology and social media in particular can affect our self-esteem. When you're on social media all the time and looking at other people's curated posts, you can have this experience of comparing their lives to yours, which we all do. But the problem is, it's not an apples to apples comparison. You're comparing their best days to your average days. And it's not a surprise that many of us come up short. And so that can erode our sense of how fulfilling or how good our life is. But think about it for our kids in particular. If they're not only experiencing that, but if they're also being bombarded by messages through traditional media and social media that tell them that they're not thin enough, they're not good looking enough, they're not smart enough, they're not popular enough. All of this not being enough, can actually seep into how people see themselves. And the reason this is so important for our connection with other people is because it turns out that our ability to connect with other people is grounded in our ability to connect deeply with ourselves, which means knowing that we have worth, knowing that we have value, being comfortable with who we are, being grounded, calm, and centered. And when we approach other people from that place of knowing we're enough, of being centered, we're often more able to listen to them, to focus on the interaction, to be present. Whereas when we approach people from a standpoint of not feeling like we're enough, then we're often seeking validation. We're trying to be somebody that we think they want us to be. And those interactions are never as fulfilling as they otherwise could be.
Vivek, when I wrote a book back in 2012 called Talking Back to Facebook, and I thought it was going to be about privacy. And I thought it was going to be about the lack of privacy that Facebook and some of the other big tech companies had introduced into our lives, a subject that Common Sense Media is very concerned about and has remained very concerned about and has actually passed major laws about. But the truth is, when I did the research for the book, I was thinking about kids. I was really talking about the impact on kids and teens. And it was the comparative culture that you're referring to that blew me away. And I had, at that point, 2 teenage daughters who I knew were going on to, at those days it was Facebook, Instagram was just starting to become popular. Snapchat was still, the figment of a Stanford junior's imagination that hadn't happened yet. But what blew me away was the comparative culture and the fact that kids felt their self-esteem was so at risk. And I could see it in my own 3 children at the time, my 2 daughters and our older son, and that they were always comparing themselves and also doing this perfect stuff. They always had to make everything look perfect on their social media feeds. And it had a big impact on their body image that you just mentioned. Not thin enough. Both girls, always not thin enough, and trying to have a perfect image, which of course we all know is impossible. Do you think that is even greater today in 2020? And also, do you think that's been heightened during the COVID-19 epidemic? This whole comparative culture that social media leads to, that you're referring to.
Yeah, so I think, the culture of comparison that you're referring to, Jim, obviously that existed long before social media, but what social
Right.
media has done is dramatically accelerated it. Like I received those kind of messages about not being popular enough, but looking enough, et cetera. We all did, as we were growing up, but I was getting it through a few channels, right? And now if you're growing up, you're just getting it through so many different channels, and the volume is just dramatically turned up. I think during this time of COVID-19, it's really interesting what's happening. I think some people, like many parents, like my wife and I, who have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, we have always tried to put limits on screen time for our children, and are finding ourselves now in the midst of this pandemic, when we're trying to telework and homeschool kids and do everything. Like, we're finding that it's just really hard to do that, and those lines have just eroded, and our kids are spending more time on screens than we would like them to. But frankly, we're not sure what else to do. Like, if you just survive. And I know a lot of parents are in this boat. But what I'm finding also is that there's an explosion in terms of creativity and I think exploration around what kids should be using now. There's been a proliferation of new tools. You have helped create some of these yourself, Jim, and others that parents are able to turn to give their kids a richer experience. Here's where I worry. If you are feeling lonely during this pandemic because you can't go out, if instead you turn to social media and you're passively consuming the posts of other people, we know from research that's actually been done on that kind of use that it can actually deepen your sense of loneliness and isolation. But if you're using social media to actually reach out and connect with individuals, to have conversations with friends maybe you otherwise weren't talking to, then it can actually be beneficial. So I find that there are a couple of ways to use technology now during COVID-19 that can be particularly helpful. So one is, if we make it a point to spend at least 15 minutes each day with someone that we love, whether it's video conferencing them with them, or calling them on the phone, or writing to them, that can be a powerful way to establish a lifeline to the outside world. The second thing we have to do, though, as we use technology, is to ensure that we are eliminating other distraction when we're talking to others. And what that does is it boosts the quality of our interaction. So even if you're busy and you don't have a single minute more to spend talking or engaging with others socially, if you focus on increasing the quality of that interaction by giving others the gift of your full attention, that can have an extraordinary impact on how fulfilling that connection feels, even if it's aided by technology. And the third thing that we can do during a moment like this is we can look for opportunities to serve others. One of the things that surprised me in the writing of this book was that service is one of the most powerful antidotes to loneliness. And it turns out that technology can actually be very helpful in this regard by connecting us to other people through social media and other platforms that may have needs that we can help to fill. Here's the thing about serving others. Service in the age of COVID-19 can't look like going and volunteering at a soup kitchen in your community.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be that. It can be checking on a neighbor who might be struggling to get groceries. It could be delivering food to a friend who might be having a hard time teleworking and taking care of their kids. It could be offering to virtually babysit for even 10 minutes to give your friend a moment to sit down and breathe, which I will tell you as a fellow parent can be extraordinarily valuable and much, much appreciated. These are small, simple things that actually can be aided by technology. I've seen high school students getting together actually in groups online to identify people that they can serve and to actually engage in group service, whether it's collecting money to donate to a hunger organization, or whether it's getting together to make masks virtually that they can then send and drop off to a hospital or clinic in their neighborhood. So tech can be used to connect us, but what we have to do is be very intentional about how we use it. We have to be aware of the downside risk of using it in ways that weaken our connection. And if we use this moment to sharpen how we use technology, to double down on our commitment to people and relationships in our life, I actually think we may be able to come out of this pandemic more deeply connected, more, I think, astute and keenly aware of how to use technology to further our connection with each other.
Well, I think that there's some really interesting stuff there. I mean, one, I will just say, the idea that service is a really good way to deal with loneliness resonates so much with me. I mean, as I said, the loneliest period of my life, definitely in high school, in the first couple of years of high school, really, to this day, I'm very aware that was the worst period of my life. And I really felt lonely. And the thing that got me out of it in many ways, and I was surrounded by people, but I still felt very lonely. But the funny thing is service. That's when I really realized that I wanted to go do what I ended up doing for the rest of my life and work with kids. But it was service that actually, I think, got me out of it. And it's very interesting to hear you say that. And I do think it's true. The other thing I think that you said that's so important is that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And this is a crisis that we're in right now, this epidemic. And we as a society are handling it to varying degrees with varying degrees of success. And obviously individually we are as well. But it is an opportunity for all of us. I speak with my wife and my kids about that all the time. What are we learning out of this? What is the good stuff? Including your 15 minutes a day. I try to talk to each of my kids for 15 minutes a day now.
That's great.
Just to have some conversation. But let me ask you a question about the technology stuff that's weird for me. So all of us are using Zoom calls now, or some type of Zoom call. And actually we made a big partnership with Eric, the CEO of Zoom, on Wide Open School, so that we could make that available to millions and millions of students around the country. But if I go through a day of Zoom calls, I feel weird. What is that? I do not like this. It does not feel the same to me. And I find myself sort of feeling, I don't know if I'd say weird, but anxious, and sometimes sort of, I don't know if I'd say angry, but annoyed. If I've been on a lot of Zoom calls, I don't like it. But yet I'm looking at you in the face. I mean, we're on a Zoom call now. What do you think that is? Because I know I'm not the only person who feels that about that kind of interaction. What do you think that is?
It's such a good point you're bringing up, Jim. A lot of people have been experiencing the Zoom fatigue that you're talking about.
Yeah, real fatigue.
And I've felt it too. I mean, I've spent a number of days being on 6-7 hours of video conference calls, and I'm exhausted by the end of it in a way that I'm often not when I'm doing in-person meetings. I think there are a couple of things going on. I think while video conferencing is a richer medium than, let's say, texting someone or just emailing them or even calling them on the phone, it is still not the same as being in person, right? And what we are also doing when we're video conferencing is, because our systems have evolved over thousands of years to try to pick up on facial expressions, on tone of voice, on body language, in addition to the content of people's speech, our instincts are leaning forward and trying to grasp signals from what we're seeing on the screen. And they're just not as easy to do as they are in person. So there's a sense of fatigue there as well. When you're on these video calls as well, you also feel like you have to be on all the time. And that can be really challenging for people as well. So when you put all of this together with one final thing, which is that being on video conference often involves sitting down and not being physically active, which also has an impact on our mental and emotional energy. All of that can be really draining. So one of the things I try to do now when I have days that are filled with work-related calls is I actually try to make sure that while some of them should be Zoom, I try to actually make some of them phone calls as well, so that I can walk as I talk. And that activity actually is incredibly helpful for me. It gives me a few minutes where I feel like I can be off. I have to commit to myself. I'm not going to be checking email and doing other things, because then I just feel more exhausted. But if I just focus on walking and on listening and talking on the phone, that can be much more restorative to me. And I pepper that throughout my Zoom call days, and it makes it much, much more endurable.
That's funny. This is not rehearsed. That is exactly what I have found, is that I now cannot sit in front of 6 or 7 hours worth of Zoom calls. I just cannot handle that. And I need to get outside. And I actually like to have calls now, normal calls, right? Without a screen. It's fun to do a Zoom call or a FaceTime call with my kids in particular. But I actually like just having normal old phone calls, just like we used to. And then when you're outside, you can see, you get exercise, you can see other people, you can see that we're all trying to cope with the situation we're all handling. That's very interesting, because I have found that has worked much better for me now, to break up my day and get outside and just make phone calls. And if I want to stay in touch, and it's just, or just take an hour by myself, by the way, which is, and just like chill. And I don't mean working and reading emails or other things. I mean, just chilling and reading a book or going for a swim or whatever is available to us. But I do think it's because part of what's interesting is, how do we learn from this for the long term? Because this is a unique situation in our lifetime. I mean, I'm older than you, Vivek, and we've never gone through anything like this. And I worry about my kids. I really worry about our 16-year-old, and you have a 3 and a 2. I mean, they just don't, actually a 3 and a 2-year-old don't even understand like a 16-year-old teenager does about how much they're missing out on all the social interactions with their friends, et cetera. But I do think a lot of it is what do we learn going forward? I have a question for you about some of the ugly stuff that we've seen crop up. Look, as for years at Common Sense, we've dealt with stuff like cyberbullying, hate speech, really mean behavior that can happen with the anonymity of online platforms and social media platforms. Do you think that the COVID-19 epidemic and the fact that so much of the time we're now restricted in where we can be and we're in front of a screen way more than normal, and some of the old balance rules just don't apply, do you think that has increased some of the really ugly sides of communicating via technology, cyberbullying, hate speech, racist speech, et cetera? Do you see that as a likely out? And those are public health issues, in my opinion. What do you think?
They are. I mean, and some of this is unique to COVID-19, I think, because of the nature of the virus, of where it originated in Wuhan in China, and because of the way some of our political leaders have talked about the virus and have emphasized its origin in China. I think that has unfortunately placed many people who either are of Chinese origin or even look like they might be of Chinese origin in a place where they are receiving dirty looks and really unkind remarks, and that's an unfortunate. And I have heard that from many people. My wife is Chinese American. Like our children look like they are of East Asian descent as well. So this is something we're concerned about and sensitive to, also just because this shouldn't be happening in the United States of America.
Correct.
So I think that's sort of one thing that's specific to COVID-19. But I think there's something broader, which is that this is also a time of great fear and anxiety for people. And unlike a hurricane or tornado, which visits great destruction upon a population, but then ends at a defined time, we don't know exactly when the chaos of COVID-19 is going to end. And I think that uncertainty combined with the threat of this novel virus has created a great deal of fear in many people. And we all react differently to fear. So some of us will withdraw, and some of us will just, we'll experience our energy go down and we'll just find it hard to get up and actually do anything and interact with people. Others react to fear with anger, and they'll lash out at others because the lack of control that often generates that fear can be really disconcerting for some. And when you're angry at someone, when you visit violence upon another person, that creates a level of certainty and control in your life that in the short term can feel good. In the long term, it's destructive to both people. But I do think that that's one of the reasons why you see more anger. The longer this goes on, I worry that the more that will go on. This is why I think there are two things that are really critical here. One is to be especially mindful of how we're using technology now. I think that using tech more to connect with people one-on-one in small trusted groups is great. But participating in anonymous forums online, reading the comment sections of articles and trying to participate in dialogue there, if you can even call that dialogue, these I find to be profoundly unhelpful and not really good ways to foster connection in your life. There's one last thing here to mention though, which is that this is a time also when people are scared, when leadership really does matter and how they respond to that fear. We could respond to fear by either turning on each other, or we can respond to fear by recognizing that the only way we get through this is together, and by actually bonding more deeply with each other and stepping up to support each other. And the thing is, each of us has the capability of going in either direction. And what we choose is often influenced by the people around us, by the messages we're hearing. I'm not just talking about our CEOs and the leaders, our elected leaders, and the messages that come from them, although those are incredibly important. But I'm also talking about the message that we send to our children as we model how it is that we should respond to this moment of fear. Do we turn on each other as parents? Do we lash out at neighbors? Do we make derogatory comments about others in our community? Or do we reach out and help others, recognizing that if we're scared, other people are probably scared too? So the way we model how to respond to fear for our kids, the way we model it in our community, this has a real impact. It's one of the reasons I actually have felt really hardened as I've looked around my neighborhood and the country and have seen neighbors stepping up to deliver meals to others who are struggling, to deliver groceries. I've seen people putting up signs thanking healthcare workers and grocery store workers for being on the front lines. In moments of crisis, Jim, and when the chips are down, I think that's when we understand what people are really made of. And what we're seeing is people stepping up with compassion, with kindness more often than not. I think that's ultimately who we are in our better moments. And we can help each other to stay in that place and to be kind in moments of crisis, but we got to do it together.
That incredible. I could not agree more. That is an incredibly profound point. And you know, I would agree with you. What I see in my daily life, in my own neighborhoods, in my own communities, is people stepping up, and in a way bonding and creating a greater sense of community in some cases than previously existed. But then there is that extraordinary lack of leadership at the top, and there is the fear-inducing behavior of some of the most important figures in our society that I find absolutely mind-boggling. And I think when we as a society look back, we shock that there's no question that it's a unique time where leadership matters. I have a question for you about the digital divide, and then I want to go to questions from the audience. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a public health expert like yourself, Vivek, to see the data about the fact that the COVID-19 epidemic is wreaking havoc on low-income and communities of color much more than any other communities when it comes to death, infection rates, et cetera. And oftentimes, if you think about it, you're talking about lower income communities. People are jammed together in much less nice settings than I'm sitting in right now, or that the Steyer family or the Murthy family is living in. And you think, what is the stress level on them? And we bring up the digital divide in the context of our education work because there are millions of kids literally who don't have connectivity at home, or Wi-Fi or devices so that they can even go to online school like most kids are doing right now. What do you think about the digital divide in the context of both the issues around loneliness and isolation, but also in the COVID-19 epidemic?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this digital divide like long before this pandemic. I mean, Common Sense Media has been raising awareness about this issue for a long time, and it has been an issue that has been studied, but not one that I think has risen to the level of priority I think that we now recognize it should. Because it turns out that, for many people think if you don't have broadband access, that means that it's just not easy for you to surf the internet and then you use your phone instead of your computer. This is so much more than that. Obviously, if in COVID-19, if you're a child living in a family who doesn't have broadband access, either consistently or at all, that means that distance learning is just incredibly difficult for you. You are at a disadvantage. If you have health problems and you can't see your doctor in person, for all the reasons that we know people can't get together now, you can't rely on telehealth if you don't have broadband access. I was also, just looking at some interesting data earlier today, just even around mental health and substance use disorders in our country. There has been an 891% increase in calls to the federal hotline for people who are in emotional distress and feeling suicidal. An 891% increase this past March compared to the year before March. And if you are struggling with mental health challenges and you need to talk to your therapist, but you don't have broadband access to do it, how are you supposed to get the care that you need? Similarly with substance use disorders, counseling is such an important part of that experience. Getting together with groups like AA is so important. And if you can't do any of these online because you don't have access, you are just at a profound disadvantage for your health, for your education, for your overall well-being. So as we think, what COVID-19 I think has helped us to recognize is the digital divide is a public health divide. It's an education divide. It's fundamentally a quality of life divide. And if we're not able to address that, then we are creating inequities that start at the very beginning of a child's life and continue to create difficulties for them later on. We know educational disparities that build now are reflected in a difference in opportunities tomorrow. We know health problems that are unattended to today will develop into full-blown disasters, later if they're not cared for. And so
Yeah.
this is why, as we come out of this, as we ask the question, how can we make sure that we are never caught flat-footed again, that if another pandemic comes our way, which it will at some point, that we are prepared and we have the infrastructure to still take care of every man, woman, and child in this country. We have to ensure that we are closing that digital divide. It has to be a key part of the strategy.
I agree, and it is a huge part of the Common Sense mission right now, and your words could not be more on point. Look, I hope we can have a subsequent, much longer discussion about that here on the Common Sense and Wide Open School platforms and others. But I want to make sure we get to some questions from the audience. So let me give you a couple. We got a bunch of them. These are very personal, so I'm going to read a couple of them and see what you think. One is, I think it's very interesting. My mother is in a retirement home and we can't be with her during the pandemic for obvious reasons. How can we help her feel less lonely? And number one, and then I have a follow-up that's very similar to that. How would you deal with that? Because millions of people are in that situation.
Yeah, I think these are heartbreaking situations. And to the person who asked that question, I just want to say I'm sorry that you're not able to see your mom and that she's not able to see you. This is really tragic. And I think this is another place where broadband access is very important.
Yeah.
Because one of the lifelines for people who are in long-term care facilities is they need to be able to video conference with their family, which means they need the access, they need the technology there as well to be able to do that. I would also say, though, that being able to also just hear one's voice, even if it's just calling on the phone and talking, is incredibly important. I have found also that sometimes when we think about video conferencing and calling people on the phone, we think about that as a very goal-directed effort. We have something to say, we have a question to ask, we call, and then when the question is answered or we've said our part, we hang up and we move on. But one thing actually that I have found to be really poignant that I learned from a friend in the hospital who started doing this with patients who couldn't receive visitors because they had COVID-19, is they would actually set up an iPad in the room and they would keep it tuned. They actually would set up a group Zoom call so that 5, 10, 15 relatives could all join. And they would leave that on for hours and hours throughout the day. So it could be like people were just dropping in and saying hello. And even if they were all just working side by side or doing something on their own, they had this feeling that they were at least virtually present in the same room together while they were going about their life. And that was a simple but powerful way that they helped patients in the hospital feel a deeper sense of connection. So there are, while it's not the same as being in person, while we can do these things that I mentioned, while you can go to a facility and look from the outside in through a window, which I know many people have done. Right. These are small things that I think are so much better than not being able to have contact. But I will say finally that one of the things we've got to figure out is we have to have much better infection control practices in our nursing homes and long-term care facilities. You know, almost a third of deaths from COVID-19 in the United States have taken place in nursing homes. The infection has spread like wildfire there. And we've seen that there have been infractions and an inability to really execute on what we know are tried and true infection control practices. When people who have spent their whole lives caring for others, giving to this country in various ways, find themselves in the final years of their life at greater risk and not being taken care of in the way they deserve, I think that's a tragedy. It's an injustice. And coming out of this, one of the other things we have to do is make sure we're taking care of our elderly and that we're caring for people in facilities in particular.
It's so true. So I think we have about 5 more minutes. So I have a couple of questions. The first is also from the audience. The first is about, how do you suggest talking, I could ask this one. How do you suggest talking to teenagers about loneliness and the importance of connection? I don't think that many teens understand how to talk about loneliness and necessarily understand that being in front of the screen isn't the best thing for them to be doing all day long. What do you think? How do you talk to teens about this? Even though your kids are younger, Vivek, mine aren't. How do you talk to teenagers about this?
Yeah, well, this I always approach this kind of question with humility because I'm just a parent who's trying to learn how to do it myself. But
you will have your time. Your day will come. Your day will come.
I know, but I found that there are a few things that can be helpful. So one actually is, you know, before I had my first child, I remember a friend said to me, Your children may listen to what you say, but they will more likely listen to what you do, and they will learn from your example. And so I think how we demonstrate living a connected life, how we prioritize people, how we speak openly about issues like loneliness will influence what our children feel comfortable doing. That's number one. I think the second thing is for us to give our children a vocabulary for how to express the feelings that loneliness drives. And many people just don't know what to call it. When I've talked to people about loneliness, sometimes they'll say, "Oh no, I'm not lonely. I just kind of feel like I just want more people in my life. I just want more connection, but I'm not really lonely." Like people don't really know exactly how to think about or verbalize what they're feeling. But by opening up that discussion with our kids, by telling them, hey, loneliness is something that all of us go through. It doesn't mean that we're broken. It's a normal signal that our body sends us when we're missing something we need for survival. And here's what it could feel like. That simple conversation actually is really important. And even if they don't say a single word back, and if they're like, yeah, I don't need to hear this, it will make a difference for them to know that was said and to have a framework for thinking about it. The third thing to do, which I think is really also important, is to enable them to actually see and hear the stories of people who are like them, who are their age, I should say, who may be dealing with loneliness, but who have been able to find ways to build greater connection in their lives. This is one of the reasons I wrote this book, is it was an exploration of topics around loneliness and connection, but I included these stories in there of young people, high school students, college students,
Correct.
who are struggling with loneliness, so that other children could read this and understand what that looks like, could see that there was actually a pathway forward from there. So I think understanding this from their peer group is important. There's an organization that I talked about a bit in the book called Beyond Differences. It was an organization started by Laura Talmas.
We know them well, yeah.
Yeah, but what I love about Beyond Differences is that was a program set up in middle schools in collaboration with high school students to help kids think more about loneliness, be comfortable talking about it, and most importantly, reach out to others who may be struggling with loneliness to help them build a more connected life. So now there are more and more people who are talking about loneliness, whether it's, and this is again a place where selectively, social media can be helpful, where selected videos from YouTube where kids talk about their challenges with loneliness and how they overcame them can be really destigmatizing. So these are a few small ways that we can deal with this. But the last thing I think it's worth saying about kids, pardon me, is that every child's need when it comes to social connection and the proper use of technology is a little bit different. And part of what we have to keep track of in a child's life is to understand how their connection, how their use of technology may be impacting other pieces of their life that we care about. Is their academic performance suffering? Are they having sleep disturbances? Are you noticing that their mood is often more depressed than usual? Do they seem more angry and irritable than usual? Although I know some of that's just part of growing up, but
Correct.
we know our kids, and sometimes we can tell when their behavior pattern has changed. And recognizing that loneliness can crop up and manifest in different ways. If we've already established with our children that we can have conversations about topics like loneliness and social connection, about how to build a rich life and what rich relationships are really like, then we can at that point start to explore with them. We can ask them, who their friends are, who are they spending time with, what are those conversations like, how do they feel after they finish a conversation with a friend. This I found to be really, really interesting. It's something I call my turnaround test, and it's something I realized was helpful when I was in medical school. I would sometimes in med school when I first started, and I had a whole group of 100 people who I was just meeting for the first time, didn't know any of them. But I remember going to these happy hours and talking to people and laughing during these conversations and sharing a lot and seemingly being very gregarious, which was unusual for me as an introvert. And then I would turn around at the end of that conversation and I would feel profoundly drained. I'd be like, wait, what happened? I thought I was having a good time. But when I reflected on those conversations, I would often realize that I was trying too hard. I was trying to be funnier than I actually was. I was laughing at jokes that I actually didn't think were that funny. I was trying to be who I thought the other person wanted me to be. And it was frankly exhausting. And it took me years and years to realize that. But I don't think it has to take kids years to realize that. I think if we're able to have conversations with them, to ask them, so how'd you feel after you hung out with that friend? Did you feel better about yourself? How do you feel about yourself when you're around this group of people? that can help our kids to start to think more deeply about how their interactions with others actually affect them.
That is a great that is a great suggestion. And when your kids are a little older, they're going to appreciate that very much from you, Vivek, and from Alice. Okay, final question. And we could go on, and we will go on. We're going to find more ways to have Dr. Vivek Murthy's wisdom shared with our audiences. But here's my last question from the audience. And in your book, you talk about tipping the world toward love. I love that concept. Can you talk about tipping the world for love as we emerge from the pandemic? Let's end with that question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jim, for asking that. I think, when I think about the whole subject of loneliness and social connection, and when I think about the last 2 years that I spent immersing myself in other people's lives to understand their journeys, I realized that what this topic really is about, the topic of loneliness and social connection, is it's really about love. It's about where we find love in our life. It's about the need that all of us have to give and receive love. I worry that sometimes our children think that their source of worth is determined by their ability to be successful, and their ability to be successful is determined by whether or not they can acquire wealth or power or fame. But I believe our true source of worth as human beings is in our ability to give or receive love. And when we're cut off from that, we feel lonely. The reason this became such an important realization for me is that over the years, as I've looked around at the world, I've come to realize that when we come from a place of love in how we treat others and how we approach our work in the world, then that love often manifests as generosity, as compassion, as kindness, as empathy. But when we are coming from a place of fear, then that manifests as insecurity, as jealousy, as anger, as sadness. And so much of our life is a struggle between love and fear. What motivates us and how we respond to issues that come up? How do we deal with a challenge that we may see in our community? What do we choose to speak up on in the public square? And I came to realize in my own life, as my wife and I, Alice, looked at our children as they were growing up, I came to realize that while we can't protect them for their entire lives, while we can't always be there to ensure that nobody hurts them or treats them poorly, what we do want to do is everything that's within our power to tip the world towards love, so that there's more compassion and kindness in the world, so that when they stumble in school, there's somebody to help them up. When they make a mistake as an adult, there's someone to give them the benefit of the doubt. That's what we want to contribute to. And the way in which we want to do that is by thinking carefully about how we treat other people, by choosing what we work on in the world to ensure that it's something that expands the amount of love that exists. We want to also choose what we speak up on in the public square, recognizing that sometimes we have to speak up for love and defend love, because ultimately it is our values that form the foundation on which we build everything else. And if we truly believe that we are better together, if we truly believe that we are better when we are kind and compassionate and loving toward another, we should make sure that those values are reflected in how we design workplaces, in how we build our schools and design curricula for our students, and how we choose people at the ballot box to lead our country, to lead our counties and our cities and develop our policies. Those values have to run through everything we do. Jim, if I had one simple credo for this book, it's a question I was asked actually early on by my publisher and others. And I didn't have a simple line. I've never been good at summarizing everything in one sentence.
Right.
But what was very interesting to me is after the book was published, I realized what that simple one-line credo was. It's 3 words. It's put people first. That is the philosophy that I want to use to guide my own life. It's what I hope that we can do collectively as a community, because I've realized that what has happened over time is that people, as important as they are in our life, have been edged out. They've moved to the margins as work has increasingly taken over the central aspect of our lives. But this is our opportunity to build people-centered lives, to build a people-centered world. And when we build a people-centered life, we prioritize relationships in terms of where we put our attention, our energy, and our time. In a people-centered world, we think about how to construct and design the building blocks of society, our workplaces, our schools, our neighborhoods, in ways that strengthen human connection. And we realize ultimately that old African proverb, which says that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We are meant to be together. We've evolved as interdependent creatures, and we are beings who thrive when we are able to give and receive love, which we do most tangibly through our relationships. That's why social connection is so intrinsic and so important to who we are. And that's why my hope going forward is that we, all of us together, can build a kind of connected world that will ultimately make us healthier, that will enable us to perform better in our life, and will ultimately make us more fulfilled and create the world that our kids really deserve.
Wow, that is you could not have ended on a better note that I could agree. And you know, it's interesting, putting people first. What a beautiful credo. You know, the basic credo of common sense is putting kids first. And so that is an amazing way to end. And Vivek, I'll have many more moments to share your great thoughts and wisdom with our audience. I would just tell everybody out there that you should all go out and buy 100 copies of Vivek's book, Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection, because it is that good and that profound a message, and such a wonderful author and good friend. Bless you, and thank you so much, Vivek. It has been a joy for me to have this conversation with you. Bless you and Alice and your kids, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. My best wishes and blessings to you and your family as well. Grateful for you.
Thank you so much. This is lovely. Thanks, God, so much.